Welcome back. You're watching NewsX. I'm Rishabh Gulati. 78 million votes have now been cast even before voting day kicks off in America. That is almost half of what the total number of votes is expected to be. Expect turnout figures to be around about 60%, just over 200 million qualified voters, 160 million will vote. It's a complex voting procedure. Maybe 1 in 3, maybe even as many as half of the votes cast will be done through absentee ballots. A lot of developments have been happening because the primary candidates are still on the campaign trail. We have seen Trump, who's been lashing out and conducting rallies all across the day of November 4th in America, as of course both the coasts head into late evening. Kamala Harris has been in Pennsylvania. She's been reaching out to Puerto Rican voters. Simultaneously, Trump rallies have taken place in Pittsburgh. We've had rallies taking place in the Carolinas. We've had rallies taking place in Wisconsin, where J.D. Vance has been. Tim Walz, meanwhile, has also conducted a rally in Wisconsin. On some minor takeaways, a U.S. judge has allowed Elon Musk to continue his $1 million giveaway as he has been in Pennsylvania also campaigning. Lots of developments, but what's the bottom line? The bottom line is still that the elections in the United States, for the vast majority of people we are speaking to, are still too close to call. The election rhetoric is at its peak and perhaps the most virulent. How is it looking in terms of perspective? How is it looking as another day on election eve draws to a close? Let's open up this conversation and get some perspective. Keith Vaz joining us. He's been a former member of parliament in London. Spencer Critchley, who is a communications strategist and leans Democrat, joining us as well. Mr. Critchley, let me kick this off with you. Penultimate day has wound up. Are you ready to stick your neck out? Do we know how this is going?
No, I think one of the most remarkable features of this election is that the polls are a black box. I don't actually believe that the polling is split as evenly as the poll reports show. I believe that's the data they're collecting and interpreting. I don't believe that actually reflects the situation. So in terms of sticking my neck out, I guess I would go so far as to say whoever wins, I think they will win convincingly. And if I'm forced to choose, I would say it looks to me like Kamala Harris is going to win, just because of all of the signs apart from these evenly divided polls, which show such tremendous enthusiasm for her. And individual indications like the Des Moines Register poll, which has taken the U.S. political world by storm, which shows her gaining something like 14 points, I think, in the last month or so, and apparently being a few points ahead of Donald Trump in a state he was universally expected to win.
All right, but where's that logic coming from? What has she done right in the 3 months that she's had that Hillary Clinton could not get right?
Oh, I think there's a really dramatic contrast here. And I had at least a look at the inside of the Hillary Clinton campaign just by helping out for a short while during the primary and then during the general election. No important role there, just sort of pitching in and helping out. But it did give me something of an inside look at the campaign. And I had lots of objections to the way that campaign was run, starting with her core message and the way she presented herself. In contrast, I think, and many other political professionals think, that the Kamala Harris campaign is one of the best presidential campaigns they've ever seen. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think there's very little she or her campaign staff have done wrong. It's really been extraordinary.
Mr. Critchley, it's a trend and it's not only limited to the United States. What is making elections far more virulent? Because if you hear the conversation, we are being told the options are between a racist, immigrant hater, fascist, de facto neo-Nazi versus a communist totalitarian. Is this just election rhetoric, or do certain sets of voters on both sides actually believe all of this?
Oh, they certainly believe it. The depiction of Donald Trump as a at least wannabe fascist, I think is just based on his own constantly repeated statements. You don't need any interpretation or spin from the Democratic side, or what I think of as the pro-democracy side, because it also includes a great many Republicans and independents. And it's also demonstrated by his actions, first of all, in literally trying to overthrow the election on January 6, 2021. And for months and months leading up to that, it was a very organized effort to subvert democracy. What's driving it, I would say, though, and this is something that is still not widely understood, is that this is not a contest between the normal left and right in a normal liberal democracy. This is a contest between one group of people who believe in liberal democracy still, which includes conservatives and includes liberals on the left, and people who do not. And some of them are intellectuals who believe they have very good reasons for thinking that liberal democracy needs to come to an end, and we need an authoritarian system where the Christian God, for example, or their particular version of the Christian God, is the ultimate source of authority, not the vote of the people in a liberal democracy. Others are ethnic nationalists and believe that people they define as real Americans are the only true Americans, and so liberal pluralism has to go, and America has to serve as, again, what they think of as true Americans. That's in direct contrast to liberal democracy, which the United States was founded on to be the world's first liberal democracy.
Is there a middle ground? Because elections happen all over the world, and yes, the rhetoric, sometimes gets a bit much, and we take it with a pinch of salt, and then the elections conclude as they will in the next 24 hours. Is there a middle ground to move on to, that there is a healing touch that will come our way a few hours from now?
No, and this is something that I addressed recently in a TEDx talk, if you don't mind me promoting it a little bit, called The War of the Worldviews. The people who are in conflict with each other in the United States and in many other countries around the world don't have a middle ground because they define reality differently. They define truth differently. They define what's morally right differently. So there's no negotiating if one person defines truth according to a completely different standard from another person. You cannot even agree on what's true, which we see every day here in the United States. And as I say, we see that happening in countries around the world. And you cannot agree on how to decide what's morally right. For example, if you believe that America should be a theocracy, a Christian theocracy, which many Trump supporters do, to you it's idiotic and sinful to have sinful human beings deciding how to run the country. What should be determining what happens ultimately is God's law. There is no middle ground between those two positions. Now, I would say liberalism is the only system that humanity has ever come up with that accommodates such different viewpoints, but everybody has to agree to live within liberalism. If one side has decided they want to tear down liberalism, then you have the very serious problem that we are facing in the United States, and that, as I say, many other countries are facing around the world right now as well.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are fundamental issues. There is an ideological battle. There is a personality context. In the end, the election result is going to be a mix of all of the above. Let's get a different perspective. Here is an individual who is literally fought elections and won them for 32 years. Keith Vaz sitting on the other side of the pond. How are you looking at the very virulent campaign? You've seen an election that's taken place in your country. A change of guard has happened. It was a tough election, but it was nowhere near as virulent as what you're seeing right now. What do you make of it?
Good morning, I should say, from London to everyone. I know it's still evening for Spencer, and it's probably midday for you in New Delhi. But what an amazing contest. This is better than any Netflix series. You can't really make this up. It's The Simpsons meets House of Cards. And we don't even have an outcome. And we won't have an outcome till the very end. It is fascinating for those of us outside America who care about, and we desperately do care about, who's going to be elected President of the United States. It is going to go to the wire. I'm interested in what Spencer says about the type of campaign that Kamala Harris has run. I've been a great fan of hers for many, many years. I never thought she'd make it after the last run. I never thought she'd make it to the White House for a variety of reasons, and she's almost there. But I think for the rest of the world, this is very much about Trump, because we don't really know Kamala Harris as well as we know of Trump. He's been the dominant factor for the last 10 years of American politics. And therefore, I think from our perspective in Britain and other countries, it's whether people vote for or against him rather than whether they vote for Kamala Harris. And I think that's probably how we see it. Does it matter? Of course it matters who's president of the United States. This has been a year of change of governments. In the United Kingdom, of course, we've now got a new government. In France, President Macron had a shock. He expected to win a majority in the French Assembly. He didn't manage to do so. I think everyone expected Narendra Modi to do better than he did in the election, talking about a landslide, 2/3 majority, all that kind of stuff. The Sri Lankan elections, nobody expected the kind of change that occurred there. So big changes. So although, of course, personalities really matter, definitely the policies are going to come to the fore. The biggest thing for me is who is going to solve the problem of Ukraine and the Middle East? These are the big problems that need to be solved on a global basis. And both candidates, whoever wins, will have to deal with that in their intray straight away. But it is tough. I mean, you do carry on campaigning to the last minute. I know that I did in my elections till 10 o'clock. I was out there knocking on doors for a third of a century, and I'm sure they're going to do exactly the same thing. I think for Trump, he said this. Spencer will tell me if I'm wrong. He said this was his last election campaign, that he wasn't going to run again. This is what he said. I don't know whether that depends on whether he wins or loses, but that's certainly what he said. I mean, age-wise, he'll be, 70, 82, older than Joe Biden is at the moment if he runs again. Kamala Harris, probably, if she loses, will have another chance to stand again. But this is an all-or-nothing election. And therefore,
why is
we
it?
are waiting with bated breath.
Mr. Vaz, why is it? Because are we overplaying it? Because we're all caught up in the emotion of it. Is there an existential crisis? Is this a ideological battle to the end?
Yes, no, we're not overplaying it. American elections are fascinating because of this archaic system they've got because of the Second Amendment, where you don't have a popular vote that decides on who's going to be president. You have little states being able to control the voting, in a sense. And Pennsylvania compared to California. I mean, I know it's important as a swing state, but it's only got 19 electoral votes, whereas California and Texas and Florida have more. So it is important to the rest of the world because this is about war and peace. These personalities really do matter. And some of the things that both these candidates have said will have a profound effect on the economy of the world, in the foreign policy of countries like the United Kingdom, and in what happens elsewhere. Maybe not so much in India, because I don't think that the Indian electorate or China, the Chinese people, would be as affected as we would be in the United Kingdom, because, of course, we claim to have this very, very special relationship, which I'm not sure how it manifests itself. But after Brexit, we really do need the Americans if our economy is going to prosper. We're not overplaying it. Absolutely very, very important, the most important election of this year.
Let me flip the question around, because it's Donald Trump that is saying that during my time there was relative peace in the world. Ukraine would not have happened if I was around, and I intend to end it. And surely that's a good thing. That's what we want to see happen, because at the end of the day, Ukrainians are dying and Russians are dying, and a large amount of ammunition is being expended.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. Of course, the reason being he appeared to be a buddy of President Putin, and therefore, obviously, it's easier for him to pick up the phone and talk to his friend. than it is for other presidents and other political parties. But let's see if he wins tomorrow. And Spencer is the strategist. He's telling us for sure that Kamala Harris is going to be president, so we won't have that question to answer. But if Trump is president, is he going to stop the war on day one? If he's president, is he going to say to Netanyahu, you've got to stop bombing Gaza? This is how we put this to the test. It's very easy to be in opposition, saying you're going to do lots of things. But when you get into that Oval Office, you've got to make those decisions. And I'm not sure it's going to be as quick as he says it is going to be. Of course, with Kamala Harris, these wars will continue, maybe with a different emphasis. I'm hopeful that she will stop the war in the Middle East. I think she is strong enough to do that. And I think she can take more action over Ukraine, but she's not pledged to make the same changes that he is.
Okay.
So it may be the wars will go on.
All right, let's get in a perspective from Scott Faulkner. He's been the former chief administrative officer in the U.S. House of Representatives and has also worked with the Reagan campaign. Mr. Faulkner, we've had a few hours to digest further developments since we last spoke. We've seen the last-minute rallies that are taking place in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, and of course in Wisconsin and other places. Are you seeing a trend emerging, or are we still where we are, that this is just too close, it's still neck and neck?
Well, I'm hearing from a number of my colleagues, and one of the things for those of you who are going to be following the election returns, New Hampshire is going to be an interesting state to look at as an early bellwether. It closes at 7. It's a small state. It should count quickly. Trump lost it all the other 2 times, but if he beats the point spread, and there's even people, including the current governor, who thinks he might even win it. So if Trump beats the point spread in New Hampshire, it could be a very interesting night. Some people are saying a Trump landslide. If Trump basically has the same point spread as 2016, 2020, then we're into the long haul. But I'm also hearing a lot of people, I'm talking to people across the political spectrum. Pennsylvania obviously is the key state. The people are guardedly optimistic that Trump will take Pennsylvania, and that McCormick, who is challenging the Democrat incumbent for Senate, may also take the Senate seat, which would then give the Republicans more than just a 1-seat margin in the Senate. So so as one is following those early returns, which should start coming in basically 24 hours from now, New Hampshire could be an interesting early sign of whether it's a long night, a short night, a cliffhanger, or a landslide.
Is it reasonable to say that this is an election about Donald Trump, that people are either voting for him or against him?
I think that it's become that. I mean, Trump is a larger-than-life personality, probably more than any other recent presidential candidate since Reagan. And it's one of these things where, unlike Reagan, who had more of a John Wayne American hero image, he's more like a Clint Eastwood, kind of the anti-hero who still cleans up the town, but is not necessarily lovable. And I think that's sort of an interesting juxtaposition between who Trump is.
Is there then a fundamental policy difference? Are we going to see America go one way or the other, come what happens in the next 24 hours?
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably one of the best watershed elections in recent memory. Again, you had the crossroads in 72 with McGovern. You had the crossroads in 80 with Reagan, Mondale in 84. And this is really the first one in a long time where you're going to see literally a 180-degree difference in the policies domestically and foreign policy, depending on who enters the White House in January.
Is there a reasonable enough crisis in the American economy? Because other than inflation, all the other numbers look fine, and the global economy looks fine. Is there a crisis that's there for living and breathing people in the country?
Well, I mean, clearly, I mean, the employment numbers of only 12,000 that came out earlier earlier was, that was a huge disappointment and a shock to a lot of people. Very weak economy, but but people feel the pain at the wallet, and people vote their wallets. When you go to the store, no matter what the stock market's doing, no matter what all the indicators are doing, when someone goes to the store and knows that they're paying 20% more than they were 4 years ago for basic things from milk to cereal to bread to eggs, that's something that gets their attention. And one pundit for Clinton way back when said it's the economy, stupid. Americans tend to vote their pocketbook. So that's one thing that's going in Trump's direction.
All right. Let me get Keith Vaz back into this before I get Mr. Critchley back in. Keith Vaz, what was the fundamental change? Because the context in the election that is concluded in your country was different. You had an incumbent government which at least the party had been in power for an extended period of time. It had seen an internal crisis and leadership change happen once, twice, and the third time. There was more of a writing on the wall of where this is headed. Why was that fundamentally different in terms of a left and right contest than what we're seeing in America?
Well, the biggest difference, I think, first of all, it was the issue of leadership. You had 5 prime ministers, from David Cameron to Rishi Sunak, over a very short period of time. So people were really fed up every time they opened a newspaper, another prime minister had resigned. I think the second issue was cost of living. I think, as exactly like Scott has said, people vote with their pocketbooks everywhere in the world, not just in America. The cost of living crisis was very severe in the United Kingdom. And I think the third point was probably people wanted a change. You give the incumbents a kick because they're there. And whether or not the other people who come in are any better, at least you've got rid of the people who are there. I mean, the opinion polls in the UK have changed since the general election. The opposition has now taken the lead over the Labour Party. I mean, it was a landslide victory, 402 seats, which is a massive victory, bigger than Tony Blair's. And, within 6 weeks, the opposition has taken over. How volatile is the electorate? I'm very interested. I'm interested to hear from Scott, since he's from the House, whether he thinks the House is going to change. Because I know we're concentrating on the White House, but of course what happens in the House and in the Senate is going to either shackle the next president or liberate the next president. So through you, it'd be good to know whether he thinks that the House is going to change.
Let me just pick that point with him. And but before that, it wasn't as virulent. We saw the rhetoric happen in the UK election just a few months ago. But in the end, you have a Labour Party leader who is, it is reasonable to argue, slightly more centrist than the last one. His worldview, his domestic policy view is closer to a balanced view rather than Corbyn's was. So is there a global ideological war happening, or are we just making too much of it because the American election has become a bit virulent?
Well, 20 years ago when I was Minister for Europe in the Foreign Office, Clinton started the third way with Blair, in which you didn't go left, you didn't go right, you went right down the centre. And you had a group of leaders then prepared to talk about, even though they came from the left or the right, they talk about centrist politics. It's not happening at the moment, and it's not going to happen, because I think migration, cost of living, leadership, these kinds of issues are going to be defining issues of our era. I think the biggest issue is going to be migration. Whether it's the United Kingdom or America, immigration is probably the top issue in both those countries. And it's not going to go away anytime quickly. So there are common issues, but there is no middle way at the moment. And who are the leaders who are going to be prepared to step forward? I suppose Macron would try, but Macron was quite good at sucking up to Trump when he met him, and then sucking up to Biden. He's quite an operator, Macron. If that's where the centre is, remember what we all know. If you walk in the middle of the road, you usually get run down. So people have to choose their sides if they're going to carry on in politics. It is very toxic politics in every country in the world. The Americans don't have a monopoly on this. It's happening everywhere in the world.
Well, the beginning of the Trump presidency was a lot of awkward moments with the same Emmanuel Macron. But in international politics as well, sometimes you have to be pragmatic. President of the United States is the president of the United States. So let me get Spencer Critchley on this. Mr. Critchley, if there is a presumption, and it's a reasonable presumption, that all the other issues put aside, there is an issue in America that inflation has hit people hard. And if that's the case, why can we still be blaming Trump?
Oh, well, this is actually a real bugbear of mine. It's an area where I wish Democrats would actually learn something from Republicans and realize they should not run away from their message because they think maybe it's polls badly. If you actually look at the substance of the inflation issue and the rest of the economic issue, everything argues for what Biden has been doing, including inflation. And if I may, inflation rose around the world at the same time it did in the United States for reasons obviously independent of Joe Biden. It rose less in the United States than it rose elsewhere. And once Biden came in, it came down faster than it came down anywhere else. So as hard as it might seem to many Democrats to tell that story, it's actually a good story for Biden. Nobody likes the fact that inflation spiked, and it really did spike. Biden didn't cause it to spike. What he did was solve the problem faster than any other leader in the world. And by every other measure, the U.S. economy under Biden has been better than the economy under Trump. Now, this is where Democrats could take a lesson from Republicans, including Trump. Trump will never tire of telling you he had the best economy anybody's ever seen. In fact, if you measure it, I think it was roughly about seventh among post-war presidents, worse than Jimmy Carter's economy, for example. Not to say Carter's economy was awful, but it was not one of the best. Biden's economy has been extraordinary. The Economist recently devoted, as you probably saw, a cover story referring to the American economy as the envy of the world. Even the Rupert Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal recently ran a headline just within the last few days saying that whoever wins this election is going to inherit a strong economy. That didn't happen by magic, which, by the way, is, I'd say, how Trump promises to produce a healthy economy, is essentially by willing it into existence through the force of his magical personality. So the economy is a handicap politically for Biden, and it's been inherited by Harris. But I would say partly because it's always difficult to run against a spike in prices that did happen, and partly because Democrats, as I say, for some reason run away from stories like this instead of leaning into them, because if they could lean into this story, it's actually a good story for them. Not that high prices are good, but what Democrats have done to bring those prices down, and by every other measure, is a very good story for Democrats. But you have to be able to.
But when it comes to practice, Scott Faulkner, before I ask you the question about how the Senate and the House of Representatives is headed, in terms of practice, what changed under Joe Biden? When it came to immigration, was it fundamentally different? When it came to oil and gas exploration and fracking in Alaska, was it fundamentally different? For people watching the broadcast, we have almost forgotten that in the past 10-15 years, America has become nearly energy independent. They are producing as much oil as they consume, which is a big deal in global affairs. It's a big deal for oil prices across the world. Was a Joe Biden fundamentally different in policy?
Well, of course. I mean, he basically eliminated 92 separate executive orders put forth by President Trump regarding the border. And the border crisis is huge. And for many years, they said there is no border crisis. And now we have spikes.
Excuse me, I think we're talking about the economy, though, right?
Well, he was asking about reversals of policies across the board. And certainly the border crisis was totally in Biden's making. The other thing regarding the economy, we have to remember that the economy was starting to rebuild itself after the COVID pandemic, and Biden came forth with two huge $1 trillion plus appropriation bills, which Vice President Harris was the tie-breaking vote on one of them. And this drove the economy into this, this huge spike, 9% plus inflation was government overspending. Now, the rate of increase has gone down, but again, it's the rate of increase. The numbers have not gone down. Again, we can talk all day long about detailed economics and fiscal policy, but the people who are voting right now and have been voting for several weeks in most of the states, they go to their local store and they load up on groceries, and they know that 4 years ago it cost them this much for a basket of groceries, and it's costing them 20% more in some case, and depending on what they're buying, even 20, 30, 40% more on some of the things that they're buying in the store. And they're mad about that. Right now, all the surveys, and we're talking all the way across the board, several dozen different surveys, Trump, number one, the economy is the number one issue on voters' minds in America. Number two, Trump is ahead of Harris by 20% or more points as being trusted to handle the economy better. Those things are going to weigh in tomorrow's count.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you the question, because for people watching the broadcast, a third of the Senate votes every 2 years, or goes to vote every 2 years. There are lots of other battles taking place, which are very complex in the rubric of a democratic election that's dominated with the headline presidential battle. But the governors are going to be elected. The House of Representatives is being elected. How are those battles going as far as you see them, Mr. Faulkner?
Well, each state unlike countries, especially like England, you don't usually have national elections because we don't have a national parliament situation. So you have, in the Senate, the Democrats have to defend a lot more incumbents, which usually makes them more vulnerable. We know that the Senate probably will flip unless something really crazy happens tomorrow, because West Virginia goes Republican, Montana goes Republican. There may be 2 or 3 other states that could flip, like Pennsylvania, but under any circumstances, Republicans will run the Senate. The House is a whole different matter. Just like the colleague from England, leadership's been an issue in the House of Representatives. We started with one speaker. He was toppled. Another speaker came in. We went for several weeks in both cases without a speaker. And I think people weigh in on saying that the Republicans kind of made a hash of it in the House. And there's no real major legislative victory or oversight breakthroughs that the Republicans in the House really can chalk up as victories. So, but again, we're back down to 435 individual races in America. Well over 90% plus incumbents usually get reelected. So it's a very narrow group of probably 25 or so seats that are in play, either because of vacancies or because there's a strong challenger. When the dust settles, everybody that I'm talking to says Republicans hold on to the House, but maybe only by 2 seats, which almost makes it ungovernable. In terms of the governorships, again, just like the Senate, not all governors are up at once. We're going to have a new Republican governor probably here in West Virginia. Other governors' races, usually the Republicans tend to have about a majority of like 30 states tend to have Republican governors. Then there's the legislatures at the state level. So there's a lot of races, including county government is coming up for votes as well. So all the way up and down the line. Just give you an example of West Virginia, which is probably the most Republican state in the country. We're going to sweep the Senate seat. We're going to take the congressional seats. We're going to take the governorship and probably the attorney general and the other statewide offices. But at the local levels, there are county commission races where Republicans are basically viewed as not being effective, and some people are going to split their ballot and vote for Democrats at the local level because there it's less ideological. So it's a very complex. I think there's one state, I think it's Arizona, has 75 different races, including referendums that people are having to do. They're saying it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes for each voter to go through the longest ballot in America. So there's a lot of things that are going to be decided tomorrow.
All right. Mr. Critchley, what do we know about Kamala Harris? Has she had the time to develop the persona, the charisma with which Barack Obama came in. She's not been entrenched into the political system, although she's fought her way up from being Attorney General the way Hillary Clinton was. What do we know of Kamala Harris?
Well, I think we know that, as you suggest, she actually has quite a substantial background. She is one of the most prepared candidates for president we have ever seen, actually, if you consider that she started out as a district attorney in San Francisco, was very successful and innovative in that job, and hard to pigeonhole ideologically. She was focused on what actually works to reduce crime. Becoming the Attorney General of the state of California, which ranks in size and impact with many countries in the world, becoming a U.S. Senator, and becoming a Vice President. This is a very prepared candidate by any measure. I agree with something Keith mentioned earlier, that it's been surprising how well she has emerged introducing herself as a presidential candidate on the national scene, because the first time she ran, I shared the concern of many people that she seemed to be making some of the mistakes that Hillary Clinton had made, which is coming across as too cautious and too much of a policy wonk and somewhat poll-driven. And she seems to have completely gotten over that and has absorbed the lessons of Barack Obama, which is to combine real substance with a charismatic ability to make an authentic emotional connection with people, and people of all kinds. And I've been really surprised and delightedly surprised, as not just as a Democrat, but as I say, as a member of the pro-democracy coalition, at how she has managed to do that so successfully.
Was she given enough time? 3 months. Did Joe Biden just simply hang on a bit too long?
I think there's a case to be made that he hung on too long. I can understand why that would have happened. I maintain, as do many observers, he's one of the most effective presidents we've ever had, and he continues to be very effective. And he's famous for never quitting, even when everybody counts him out. That said, I think it is possible he hung on too long. It was an incredible challenge for Kamala Harris to jump into the race virtually overnight when Biden made what I think was a deeply principled decision finally to withdraw. I would say, though, that it's also a lesson for us Americans that we could be more like Great Britain, the United Kingdom, for example, and have much shorter elections. I'm not sure we could get them down to 6 weeks because it's still a very, very large country. But I think we could do it in 3 to 6 months instead of what we have now, which is, well, it is getting on to 2 years, and in some cases, it's just a full-time campaign for president all the time.
You know, it's a very interesting concept, because in our country right now, we both are in awe of your system, where you don't have elections like we do every 3 months, because there's some federal election taking place in this country. There was one last month, and we are heading into election cycle next month as well. So we want your system, but then we are also find it very strange that nearly half the ballots are postal ballots. It's absolutely fascinating how perspectives change. So let me get Keith Vaz back into this. Keith Vaz, regardless of now who gets elected, in global affairs, what changes? Because Joe Biden went out of Afghanistan. You know, he was highly criticized for it in the manner in which he did it. But you can argue that he got Americans out of the firing line. Okay, the global war has shifted to other places. People are dying, but it's not Americans, and that's what counts back home.
There are lots of proxy wars going on. There is no doubt about that. And the issue of Ukraine needs to be addressed immediately. I would imagine the American people are saying the same as the British people. I was all for what we were doing in Ukraine, but so much taxpayers' money is now going to prop up the regime there. And really, people want peace. I'm sure the Ukrainians want peace, because so many young Ukrainians are leaving Ukraine because they don't want to fight in that war. So somebody needs to bring the Russians and the Ukrainians to the peace table. Our institutions internationally have failed to do so. The UN, we have to redesign these organizations to make them fit for purpose. They should be bringing these countries together rather than taxpayers in America and Britain and all over the world having to fund these wars. But I suppose the most present problem is the Middle East. we must see a containment of what could end up as a regional war. The bombing of Lebanon, Iran bombing Israel, the continued violence that is going on in Gaza. No American president, in my view, should allow this to continue for much longer. I think Biden could have done much more. I think the biggest problem was Obama got his Peace Prize. I think he probably deserved it at the end just for being Obama, because I'm a great Obama fan, but he probably got it a little too early. I think that the American president needs to be bringing people together. If you're leading the free world, it mustn't be about wars, it must be about
But
peace.
it's nice to say
Uh,
that. It's nice to say that. It's very nice to think that, okay, we want peace in our times, but we also have to understand why wars take place, because it suits someone somewhere to
Well,
have those wars.
of course, they're economic and it suits others, such as the armaments industry. But look at the role that, for example, Narendra Modi is playing by going over. There are actors on the world stage who don't have to be American, who can actually go and try and bring sides together. He did well in going to Ukraine and going to Russia. Unless America concentrates on the big issues, then I'm afraid the global economy is going to suffer.
Can the
I
next
have to
US
say that-
president, if it's Kamala Harris, Keith Vaz, can she reasonably be seen picking up the phone to Vladimir Putin? Because you're not going to have peace in Ukraine if Russia is not sitting on the table and agrees with you.
Well, she can do if she is. If she's elected tomorrow, she will be a mega person as far as history is concerned. The first black, the first Indian origin, the first woman president of the most powerful country the world has ever seen. She's going to have a huge amount of goodwill behind her, rather like Obama when he was first elected. And every new prime minister and president knows you have to get it done in the first 100 days. After that, it only gets worse. So she'll start with a huge amount of goodwill when she takes over in January. It's up to her to decide what to do and how she can take this forward. I want you I just have two quick takeaways to bring up. First of all, spare a thought for Joe Biden. I mean, he thought he was going to be running in this election, and he did stand down. Spencer very, very graciously says it was, he thought about it and then decided. I think the rest of us all think he was told. It's the equivalent in Britain of the men in grey suits who go and see a prime minister who refuses to step down, or someone in the House of Cards where they go and tell them, you've got to go. Joe probably got the presidency a little too late. I'm a great fan. I first met him in 1987 when he started to run for president then, when I was first elected. I think if he'd got the presidency a little bit earlier, he could have done much more. I think the rest of the world thank him for what he's done, but do feel it is time to move to the next generation. The other takeaway is I can't remember an election campaign in the world where the two principal candidates spend so much of their time dancing. I mean, the Republican candidate dancing to YMCA and Kamala Harris dancing with Beyonce. I mean, they're always dancing, these people. We've never seen this before.
The precedents that have been set here, I've been told that in a democracy, you can now distribute $1 million a day just for attending an election rally. I don't know how that's going to play out back home for me. I'd love to see it happen.
Can you imagine Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi dancing to, Jai Ho? I don't think so.
That day might just come. That day might just come. They're not. Okay. Okay. All right. Let me get Scott Faulkner back in. Scott Faulkner, let me take you back, because why is it that regardless of which sort of ideological leaning there is in governments in Europe, they were so happy that George Bush was out, that within the first 2-3 months of the Obama presidency, he organized one nuclear disarmament summit, and no nuclear disarmament happened subsequently. But he was given a Nobel Peace Prize because it was just a sheer relief that the era of the Bushes was over. Why does that happen in Europe?
Well, I think that again, there seems to be in many countries. I mean, Moldova just re-elected a very pro-West government, even though Russia tried to intervene, that you do have countries, some of the Nordic countries, some of the lowland countries, obviously Italy, have shifted conservative in the last few election cycles. So you tend to have, though, the Christian, the social democrat versus the Christian Democrat side of the spectrum, and they tend to want Democrats versus Republicans in office in America. Of course, a number of them probably are not looking forward to Trump coming back in because he forced them to ante up a lot more in their NATO donations. So but we'll see what happens. I mean, the key is that under any circumstances, NATO will be strengthened. I think that one of the big problems in the last 3.5 years is that Biden had the weakest national security team, probably in certainly in my lifetime. And I think people sense that. I mean, the fact that he reversed everything that was happening in Iran, Trump had basically put Iran back in the box. They were prostrate, they were bankrupt, and all of a sudden, all this money flowed, all the sanctions went off, and now Iran is flexing its muscles. So there's, say what you will about Trump, his Abraham Accords was brilliant because he basically sat there and realized that the Middle East was Sunni versus Shia, which has been there since the 700s and 800s. And if you create a Sunni coalition against Iran, you start to further shrink Iran's influence in the region. And the Sunnis, at least behind the scenes, cheer on Israel because Israel takes on Iran covertly and now overtly. So the chessboard was being set for peace in the Middle East, and with Iran basically being restrained.
Okay.
And all that went by the boards when Biden came in.
Okay, but all right, sitting half the world away, all right, I perhaps haven't seen as closely how a Kamala Harris works in administration, but we've seen how Donald Trump works in administration, and you'll have to accept, Scott Faulkner, that the last time around it was a chaotic administration. People were coming and going every few weeks, and there were whistleblowers writing damning books, every few months, and it seemed that it was a more chaotic than consistent.
Personnel has always been Trump's Achilles heel. I mean, all of us who even supported him have told him that before, behind the scenes to his people, that personnel, which is actually ironic because here's a person who acquired things. He acquired hotels, casinos, golf courses. He would have had, he understood how to put personnel and systems in place before the Trump brand went on. And somehow all of those lessons learned in the private sector just sort of vanished when he came into the public sector. And that's a huge disappointment to a lot of us who were hoping for more from him. But personnel has always been his Achilles heel. If he gets back in, we'll have to see if this time, if he's learned any of those lessons.
Okay. Is this Trump campaign fundamentally different from the previous Trump campaign? Are we seeing less, for example, the prominence of family in it?
Agreed. I think, well, of course, obviously the entry of Elon Musk creates some star power and certainly generates a lot more enthusiasm, putting the family sort of behind the scenes. I think one of the key things which we're going to see play out tomorrow has been that for over a quarter century, Republicans have always dug in their heels and said we only vote on election day, and that really missed a lot of opportunities. This time around, Trump and the Republican National Committee say vote early, bank your vote, and supposedly, if you start to look, there's a lot more Republicans voting early, but also some people who have not voted in a couple election cycles seem to be inspired to vote early. So that could change the count quite a bit as we move into the next 48 hours. But the key is there are differences. Trump is Trump. We like to say he's, in America, we have the Catskills, which is just outside of New York City, and there are comics there that are, we call them Borscht Belt comics, and Trump in many ways is a comic. Some of what he does, whether it's the garbage truck or or some of the other things that he did, like McDonald's. I mean, he is an entertainer. Remember, for 10 years, he had the #1 show in America with The Apprentice. So he is Trump. He's not an inspirational individual like a lot of us who work for Reagan. But the key is that in this current world of the populism and Trumpism, which is very different from the Reagan movement conservatism, very different. I mean, they're still pro-America, bold foreign policy, smaller government, but in terms of the genesis of it, the Reagan Revolution goes back to 19th century liberalism, the 18th century Enlightenment. It had a huge ideological provenance, and with people like William F. Buckley and other intellectual firepower, it was a very different movement than the kind of nationalist populist that Trump has ignited. Some of the demographics are quite different, a lot more blue collar people in the even though there were Reagan Democrats in the 80s, you still have a lot more of a blue collar feel to the Trump movement.
All right.
Which is ironic.
All right. I've just got a few minutes left, so let me get Spencer Critchley back into this. Mr. Critchley, what has happened in American politics that the last few months have become so ugly that it has taken some individuals to the level of loading up their rifles and trying to assassinate a former US president?
Oh, that's just one of these incidents. We've had, an innocent crowd of black shoppers in Buffalo slaughtered. We had innocent churchgoers slaughtered during, a church group meeting, inspired by the hatred coming from the Trump side. We had the January 6th insurrection with all of the injuries that happened during that and the deaths that followed. It's extremely alarming. And I'd like to pick up on something that Scott just said. There's much else that he said I wish I had time to argue with, but I think that what he said about Reagan and the Enlightenment liberal legacy, I think is an extremely important point, because liberalism, the broad philosophy that spans from far right to far left on which the United States was founded, is under attack right now. This is what I've been saying. It's what I address in my book. And I would also like to recommend an excellent book by the historian Robert Kagan called Rebellion, which just came out this year, which addresses this as well. And the point is that there has always been a significant part of the US population that opposes liberalism very strongly. One of the most significant upsurges of that anti-liberal feeling, of course, was the Civil War and then the Jim Crow era following it. Not all of the anti-liberal faction are that ugly and violent, but it has always been there. This is why my book is called Patriots of Two Nations. And it's something that many liberals of the right and left don't understand. So there are a great many conservatives who are big fans of Ronald Reagan, Russell Kirk, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, going back to Edmund Burke, William F. Buckley. That's the liberal conservative tradition, the conservative version of liberalism. Trumpism is not that. It opposes liberalism. And the next Trump administration will not just be Trump pursuing his own impulsive self-interest, which ultimately I think is all that motivates him. And I agree, he's a very talented entertainer. I would say he has few other talents except as a con artist. But this time he's got a whole phalanx of intellectuals who are not conservative intellectuals. These are anti-liberal intellectuals. They're dominionists, for example, who believe in Christian dominion, which is an extremely anti-liberal, dominating version of Christianity, which requires everybody to live by Christian values, for example. And then, as I said earlier, you have ethnic nationalists who believe, as Stephen Miller, one of Trump's principal advisors, said and says repeatedly, he said it just the other day during a rally, and he says it repeatedly, America is for Americans and Americans only, virtually directly quoting Hitler. So this is the contest of our time in the United States and around the world. I would say Vladimir Putin fits into this as well, because as much as I oppose using war to settle international disputes, I think we have to see the Russian invasion of Ukraine as another front in the anti-liberal attack on liberal democracy. Putin is one of the world leaders in this upsurge of religious and ethnic nationalist anti-liberalism combined with gangsterism, as it so often is.
All right, it's an interesting perspective. I'm short of time. I'll leave the last word with Keith Vaz, just to get a different perspective. He's been in politics and has an ideological leaning of his own. He's been a member of the Labour Party, a member of Parliament for 32 years. Keith Vaz, looking at America from outside, I find it difficult to comprehend as well, because I would think that sitting in what is the world's largest democracy, we would have those shared similar values. But I'm told repeatedly that religious freedom in India is useless. Press freedom in India is worse than Afghanistan. I'm being told that our country's leaders are running assassination plots all over the world. And that's happening under a democratic administration. And I've seen a George Bush who my first introduction was him reading a book upside down during 9/11. Not a happy introduction, but I've seen him go on a limb, go out of his way to reduce nuclear apartheid against India. I've seen Donald Trump being very friendly towards India. So for the rest of us in other democracies who consider ourselves liberals, why aren't we impressed by the Democrats of the recent past?
Well, it's very, very difficult, and you're absolutely right. Why it's important, though, is because America is important to the world. It has the most impressive written constitution of any country that has ever existed in the world. I mean, Britain still doesn't have a written constitution. I think we need to step back. We need to see what's happening in America and see it in a sense as a microcosm as to what's happening elsewhere. It's magnified because it is America, but this is happening elsewhere. It's not unique to the United States that you have these two diverging forces. You have the left, the right, the liberals, and the conservatives. This is happening in every country. It's happening in yours, it's happening in mine. But I think what we're all waiting for is that this is like a very long pregnancy. We just want it all to be over. we want the waters to break. We want the patient rushed to hospital, and we want the new president to be born, whoever that is. And then we want to make sure that the world can move on, because we have been waiting an awful long time for this to happen. I would not want to be the next president of the United States. I don't know about my two colleagues, Scott and Spencer. Spencer might end up as Kamala Harris's chief of staff. He said all the right things. So he might end up in the White House. I don't think Scott's going to, not if Kamala gets in. But the fact is, I think we need to have this done. And we just hope it's not going to be like, well, we hope it's going to be like Gore and Bush. I think the way Gore conceded after it went to the Supreme Court was very gracious. And we need to look at whoever the loser is and hope to God that loser concedes graciously, and that America can move on and the rest of the world can move on. And then we'll see how the dice fall on the table. These are very dangerous times, and I think we all want to wish the American electorate well, and we hope that they make the right decision, whatever that decision is.
I was mentioning this last night. There is, ladies and gentlemen, something called the wisdom of the crowd. It is a statistical fact that this does exist. And we are about to get an education from the wisdom of the crowd in America on where they feel the world should be going, where their country should be going, and balance out all the various perspectives of pulls and pushes that you've just heard encapsulated in this conversation over the last 60 minutes. I need to take a very short break. I thank my guests to Scott Faulkner, Spencer Critchley, and Keith Vaz, who has been a long-standing contributor. We wish you well and have a good evening. We take a break. See you in a minute.